Hello, and welcome to Middle East Focus, a weekly podcast on regional affairs and U.S. policy, produced by the Middle East Institute in Washington, D.C. I'm Alistair Taylor, MEI's editor-in-chief.
And I'm Matthew Czekaj, managing editor at MEI.
Following months of simmering tensions, the Syrian army and the Syrian Democratic Forces have come to blows, battling for control of northeastern Syria. After repeated failures to implement a March 2025 deal under which the Kurdish-dominated militia and longtime U.S. partner would be dissolved and its forces integrated into the new Syrian military, full-blown hostilities broke out between Damascus and the SDF earlier this month in Syria's second city of Aleppo. The fighting flared up again this past weekend, and as government forces pushed further into the northeast, building on their recent gains in Deir ez-Zor and Raqqa, a new deal was reportedly reached between the two sides on January 20th. We've got a lot to discuss today. It's a very fluid and dynamic situation. But thankfully, we are joined by an excellent guest who can help us make sense of things, Charles Lister. Charles is a senior fellow and the director of the Syria Initiative at the Middle East Institute, where he focuses on Syria, terrorism, and insurgency across the Levant. He's also the founder of the publication Syria Weekly.
Our listeners can subscribe to Middle East Focus on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and other podcast providers. And please check out MEI's other podcasts, Rethinking Democracy, hosted by Gunul Toll, and Taking the Edge Off the Middle East with Brian Katulis.
Charles, thank you very much for joining us again on Middle East Focus.
Sure, thank you for having me.
Let's dive right in. The situation in Syria has been, I think it's fair to say, incredibly fluid over the past few days. To timestamp things here for our listeners, we're speaking to you on the afternoon of January 20th. Where do things stand right now?
It's been a whirlwind of a last few days. I mean, well, officially speaking, we have a ceasefire in northeastern Syria. The Syrian government in Damascus, with U.S. clearance, has provided the SDF 4 days to internally consult on, I assume, what will be acceptable to them in terms of the mechanisms for integrating into the state. Within the framework of this deal that was announced earlier today, the Syrian government has acknowledged that its military and security forces will not enter the two core Kurdish-dominated cities of Czekaj and Kamishli. They will not enter Kurdish-dominated villages. Those areas will be secured by some form of local police. Likely that if this deal holds, and there's very big questions as to whether or not it will, but if that deal holds, those forces will eventually come under the authority of the Ministry of Interior in Damascus. So we have 4 days of consultation period. The SDF has been offered the Deputy Minister of Defense position. They've been asked to nominate a governor of Czekaj, governorate in the northeast. They've been asked to provide lists of candidates for the Syrian parliament and sort of civil service, senior civil service employees to work in various ministries, along with the announcement by President al-Shara a few days ago of a kind of comprehensive Kurdish rights decree, which in Syria's history is an unprecedented development for Syria's Kurds. Along with, finally, the demand that Syria's autonomous administration, its governing body, be dissolved and integrated into the state. So, big asks. In some ways, it remains a generous offer, considering how sour things have become over the last few days. But my condition here is, or my kind of qualification is, 4 days of consultations is a long time. A lot can happen in 4 days. Entire comprehensive ceasefires have broken apart in 90 minutes over the last week. So this is going to be a really big test of patience and command and control on both sides, with, to put it bluntly, tempers flaring in a very severe way on both sides. So by no means a guarantee that this is going to be sustained or to be achieved. Last thing I'll say here is U.S. Special Envoy Thomas Barak made his own public statement today, which was the harshest we have seen in public from him or any representative of the U.S. government towards the SDF. His basic message was, you used to be viable as a non-state actor. When Assad fell, you no longer became a viable reality. You have no choice but to integrate. That's a pretty severe message coming on the heels of having lost about 90% of the SDF's territory in the space of the 4 days.
Taking a step back, for our listeners, how did we get here? What are the kind of underlying issues or points of contention between the two sides? And what did we see happen high level over the last few days?
Well, I mean, historically, going back more than a decade, the forces that now make up Syria's Ministry of Defense and that make up the SDF have a nearly decade-long history of hostilities. So there's that history there. The SDF has more or less consistently labeled the current Syrian government as ISIS-like. They really do not trust or see any legitimacy in this government, which is basically why we have failed to see months and months of US-mediated negotiations result in a comprehensive deal and its implementation. The reality is, in March 2025, so 3 or 4 months after Assad's fall, the leader of the SDF, Muslim Abdi, our kind of longtime partner in the fight against ISIS, he was basically strong-armed into an American helicopter, flown to Damascus and told to sign what we now commonly call the Framework Agreement, the March 10th Framework Agreement. That was basically a deal in which the SDF publicly accepted that it will need to integrate into the state. Of course, then followed months of negotiations into how exactly that would happen. In October last year, October 2025, although it wasn't publicly announced, there was a comprehensive deal agreed with US mediators and French mediators in the room. All the core kind of conditions and mechanisms for integration were agreed around the table, but nothing was implemented. And in the 2 or 3 months from October until December, the US extended this kind of deadline or ultimatum on the SDF to implement the agreement. Of course, that then expired. And then suddenly we got new SDF conditions on the table, which were never going to be accepted by Damascus. That brought us into the new year. And essentially, all the various ultimatums and deadlines set by the US, not by Damascus, expired. Patience ran out in Damascus, and that's when tensions started to flare in the north.
You mentioned the ceasefire deal that was reached today, January 20th. In what ways is it different from the previous ones that we've seen in the past few days, which were agreed to and immediately were thrown out?
Yeah.
And how, I guess, optimistic are you that this one won't follow that same history?
Well, from the SDF's perspective, it's far less advantageous than it was before. The deal that had been agreed in October that I was just referencing gave the SDF 3 dedicated divisions within the Ministry of Defense for all of its fighters. Those divisions were going to be allowed to stay in the northeast and not be sent around the country. It gave them a dedicated brigade for their female force and a dedicated brigade for their kind of special counterterrorism force. None of that exists anymore. Now the SDF's integration into the state as a military and a security force is expected to be, as it's now called, on an individual basis. So that does not mean that down the line there will be dedicated SDF-era divisions based permanently in the northeast. Now, we may end up getting there if calmer heads prevail and everyone realizes there still needs to be compromise, but right now, by the wording of the deal, that's no longer an expectation. And that was kind of the core security concern for the SDF, that they retained that. They no longer have that. With US backing, they no longer have that. That's going to be probably the core sticking point. And then there's the political one. I mean, the SDF, of course, it's the Syrian Democratic Forces. To be blunt, they're not particularly democratic, but they are probably somewhat more liberal than the current government in Damascus, or at least portions of the kind of ruling class of the current government. So the SDF's view all along has been, we're the liberal Democrats here. You guys are the conservatives who don't respect democracy and what have you. And we really think you're secret ISIS fighters in disguise. So they have wanted their political ideals to be brought to Damascus. That's also unlikely to happen now. Yes, they'll have seats in parliament and they will have appointments within ministerial positions, but there's not going to be a kind of merging from the SDF's perspective of the autonomous democratic administration into the Syrian transitional government. They will be subsumed into the government this time. So basically, long story short, by choosing to fight, they've lost a lot of the more advantageous proposals on the table they had even just a couple of weeks ago. And perhaps most significantly, they appear to have lost American support for pushing those conditions. And that really does sort of spell the end for them. So they have a choice to make, I guess, which is, play along with the deal that's now on the table, or, fight to the bitter end, which is the language we were hearing from them just last night. Very severe language around wiping out tribal villages and fighting Turkey and Damascus till the death. That's their other option. But the last 4 days haven't shown that they're likely to succeed in choosing that military option.
Given everything that we've seen play out subsequently, why do you think they chose to fight?
I think from everything I have heard from US mediators, French mediators, from the Syrian government, and from some contacts in the SDF, the core negotiating team led by Mazloum Abdi, the overall kind of commander-in-chief, and one of his deputies, Ilham Ahmed, when they were at the table, the talks were very constructive, they were friendly, there were agreements, as we saw or as we heard in October, there was a comprehensive agreement made. The difficulty is, as we're now seeing, with them being granted a 4-day consultation period, the SDF is a complicated entity. Okay, it's actually become perhaps more simple over the last few days because they've lost basically their entire Arab constituency. We really only have the Kurdish militias left now, but even they are a complicated actor. Mazloum and Ilham, if you stuck them in a room with Ahmed al-Shara and his foreign minister for a week, they'd hash out the whole deal and agree to implement it. But every single time Mazloum went back to the northeast of Syria for consultations, silence. And it's an open secret as to why. Every senior US official involved in these talks is unanimous on the cause. There are spoilers within the SDF who are more rooted in the PKK movement, who have never wanted this deal to occur. Why? Because they have a peace process with Turkey, which means that the PKK cause more widely is going to disappear, assuming that process continues. And in that sense, the only thing they had left was Syria. And to do a deal and to subjugate themselves to the Syrian government in Damascus, they'll lose everything. So there were clearly spoilers in the way. And going back to the conflict we had in Aleppo city, whenever that was, 10 days ago or so, until today, we've probably had 6 or 7 comprehensive ceasefires, most of which came with comprehensive agreements to integrate. And all of them were abrogated by elements within the SDF, which shows not necessarily that Mazloum is a bad faith actor and never had an intention to integrate, but that there were elements within who clearly did not want that to succeed.
Taking a step back, how does the fighting that we've seen over the past few days, and indeed the fighting in Aleppo city that you just referenced, how does that compare to the previous flare-ups of violence that we saw on the coast last spring or in Sweden over the summer? What lessons do you think the government's learned from those previous episodes?
Yeah, I think this is an important question, which I think has got lost in an awful lot of noise and a good deal of misinformation and disinformation. But no question, there have been civilian casualties over the past couple of weeks. You sadly expect that in urban warfare. It's an sad inevitability. But this has essentially been at the core a military-to-military confrontation. The extent to which we can decipher exact numbers of casualties is still very, very murky. But to the extent that we can, 95% of them have been military fatalities. So this has not been a case in which elements linked to or within the Syrian government have gone in and massacred people in revenge, as we frankly did see on the coast in March and in Sweden in July. This has been a much more kind of cohesive, commanded military operation on both sides so far. The part of the reason for that is that almost all of the Syrian government's gains over the past few days have been into Arab majority areas where they have been celebrated on arrival by every single community they've gone into. They haven't yet gone into core Kurdish majority areas. That's where there is still a risk of real violence. Now, there have been individual cases, probably I can count on a hand from each side, of extrajudicial killings and other kind of, crimes committed against dead bodies on both sides. But compared to what we saw earlier on in the year, this is a totally black and white different case. So sure, they still have problems, but a significant kind of improvement in terms of, internal cohesion, command and control, and responsibility compared to what we have seen.
Given everything you've just said about the losses of the SDF, their loss of Raqqa and Deir ez-Zor, what kind of organization are we talking about at this point? How large? What do they still control? Where are they getting their support from at this point?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, good question. I mean, so the core kind of epicenters of their presence now is in Kobani in northern Aleppo, and in the cities of Hasakeh and Kamishli, and then strings of villages, of Kurdish majority villages around them. Early this morning, January the 20th. The last remaining Arab kind of constituent group within the SDF, called the Sanadid Force, which was made up of the Shammar tribe, publicly defected, marched north and took the Yarubia border crossing with Iraq, a hugely strategically significant area. So, as I was saying earlier, we really only have now at the core the YPG and the YPJ, the male and the female wings of the PKK Syrian wing, with a small number of very small, like there's an Assyrian Christian militia that has remained loyal to them. But really here we're talking about, and to be really blunt, we're talking about the PKK now. They're all flying Öcalan's flag. They're all talking in Kurdish, not in Arabic. And they are calling on their brethren from Turkey and Iraq to join them in the fight. So now there's no, they're not hiding their kind of core background and ideology anymore. And that's where the danger really lies in terms of potentially seeing things go back to hostilities again. The rhetoric coming out of the YPG official public channels last night was like nothing I've ever seen before. Videos, public statements, one of them basically genocidal against Sunni Arabs in and amidst this Kurdish-dominated region. So I would say I'm still quite pessimistic, frankly, that we're going to see this implemented in the way that it's been announced today. I would say this is the last chance Damascus is offering for a peaceful final solution. And if there is an abrogation of this ceasefire by either side, military fight will probably be the only way forward.
Do we know how does the average ethnic Kurdish Syrian feel about what's happened to the SDF and this turn of events?
I think the Kurdish community in Syria is a complicated one. I mean, when the SDF-linked fighters in Aleppo city lost control in Sheikh Maqsoud and Ashrafiyah, these two northwestern districts of the city, Kurdish communities elsewhere in Syria celebrated the loss of the SDF. When the government went on the offensive and took Deir ez-Zor and areas of Raqqa and sealed up the eastern Aleppo countryside just a few days ago, Kurdish communities elsewhere in Syria went out in celebration. So the Kurdish community in Syria is not just universally in support of the YPG, the YPJ, and the SDF historically. They're just not. I won't name who precisely they are, but two of the important figures within the Syrian government doing the negotiations right now are Kurds themselves. So the Kurdish community is divided. It has long been divided. There's a kind of urban Kurdish community and a more rural Kurdish community. And so it's just not simple as, we support Kurdish rights, therefore we must be the SDF. And I think that's been a dynamic that's never been appreciated, particularly amongst policymakers. I mean, we hear Lindsey Graham, for example, saying that, that warning all these various actors against, committing genocide against Kurdish rights. He's not appreciating the fact that there are other Kurdish communities all across Syria celebrating what's happening right now because they never supported the SDF. So basically, it's complex. You can ask one person in one village and they'll say this is an absolute disaster and they're losing everything they built over the last 10 years. And another one who said, well, we never wanted anything to do with that crazy project in the northeast. We want a strong central government. So it's divided. It's not an easy line to draw.
So what does this tell us about Damascus's more broader attempts to unify the country?
I mean, I know, having spoken with senior figures within the government a lot over the last few days, they did not want this to have to resort to military force. In fact, when I wrote a piece for MEI just a few days ago, one of the quotes I put in from one of the senior negotiators was their worst case scenario is having to face what he called a YPG insurgency in the long term. Now, if this ceasefire announced today falls apart, that is their future. They will have some kind of a PKK, YPJ insurgency in the long term. They do not want that to happen. They have always, I think, sought a peaceful, negotiated solution to this standoff with the SDF. So I think there's that side which is cautious. Clearly, they're trying to retain the support of the international community, but also demonstrate to other minority communities that they want to prioritize negotiations and peaceful solutions. But at the same time, I have to say, the fact that they have managed to take like 85-90% of SDF territory in 4 or 5 days has also surged their own internal morale and confidence, and their sense that they're invincible. This is the destiny now, that Syria will unite, the government will take control. And the fact that all these oil and gas fields are now under government control has given real confidence to the economy, that it can start to extract resources and make money again. And so there is two sides to this argument. There is caution, but there is also a sense that we've done it again. We overthrew Assad in 10 days, and we've overthrown the SDF almost in about half of that time. And so I worry a little bit that kind of overconfidence may result in miscalculation. But hopefully for all of Syria's concerned, calmer heads will prevail.
Switching gears a little bit, Charles, we're obviously sitting here in Washington having this conversation. How has the U.S. administration tried to navigate this kind of tricky dynamic that it finds itself in between Damascus and the SDF? Obviously, it has longstanding ties to the SDF.
Yep.
Closer relations have developed more recently with Damascus. How is it navigated that, and what should it be doing going forward, do you think?
I mean, there's been a kind of subtle internal conflict within the administration. Here I'm not talking about Congress, which is a whole different beast, but within the administration, White House, State Department, DOD, CENTCOM on the ground, a real kind of internal conflict, because there is a sense to which they feel some loyalty to the SDF because of everything that they sacrificed and accomplished together against ISIS. But as the language from the Trump administration has made clear for a long time now, the fall of Assad and the emergence of a transitional government that will hopefully become more and more representative of the people offers a totally different opportunity. There has never been a moment throughout this second Trump administration where there's been any indication that they were favoring the SDF over Damascus. It has always been the other way around. And so that's always been the direction we're headed. I think, to be frank, we also have a special envoy in Thomas Barak, who has been particularly vocal about supporting Damascus and its objectives to establish control across the country, which at times has been very helpful. I would say at times perhaps has encouraged Damascus to be more bold than it might have otherwise been. We've also had military forces on the ground who frankly have played the most forward-leaning role in terms of building a relationship with Damascus that just simply didn't exist before, and prioritizing that relationship. And whilst watching all of that, bringing the conversation back to the SDF as well, is the SDF just never seemed to really read the tea leaves. Or if they did, they totally rejected it. And the calculation was, if we managed to hold out long enough, eventually these crazy Americans are going to realize that this government in Damascus is not their natural partner, and they'll come back to us. I think that was more or less the calculation, particularly for the spoilers within the SDF who didn't want to do a deal. But now we're in a place where ultimately America's priorities are heading back to the area of counterterrorism. So the security of Al-Hol and Al-Roj camps, the security of about a dozen prisons holding nearly 10,000 ISIS men, that is the priority. And at first, that meant we didn't want conflict at all in northeastern Syria. That was the first kind of calculation or judgment. Now, more recently, over the last maybe 24 hours, it's the SDF has got to step down. And this has got out of hand, and the government just has to be provided the opportunity to take charge. And so it's been a quite interesting shift to see that calculation where Admiral Cooper at CENTCOM, SOCOM's regional leadership, they were all on the ground, on the phone. We had Vice President Vance having 2 phone calls with President al-Shara over the past few days, not public, followed by President Trump's phone call yesterday, all at first saying, just accept a ceasefire. Just give the integration talks some more time. Please just give it some time. And then over the last 24 hours, it fundamentally shifted to the SDF's days are over. They must integrate. Damascus is basically the victor. That's really what these various statements amount to. And I think that's going to be a big challenge to see if they can manage to convert that into reality.
You've referenced ISIS a few times in your last answer. How do you think the group may exploit the situation?
Well, I mean, interestingly, they've done almost nothing in Syria over the last few days, which is quite unusual. But that tells me that they're watching to see what happens. They don't want to get in the mix of stuff and lose opportunities. There may come a time when they'll try to be opportunistic. There was, appears, chaos at the Al-Hol camp earlier today as the SDF fled and the government surged resources in to try and take control. Kind of in opportunistic moments like that where you could see ISIS trying to take advantage, but we haven't seen it yet. Looking back over the last 13 months of the transition, 90% of ISIS attacks in Syria have been in SDF-held northeastern Syria. Now, that isn't because necessarily the SDF was their number one enemy. Actually, when you look at what ISIS has been saying publicly over the last year, Damascus is their number one enemy. But it is because they could take advantage of that complex kind of Kurdish-Arab tension in the northeast. Now, assuming that may subside, or at least in a significant area of northeastern Syria, that will no longer be the case because most of northeastern Syria is Arab majority and it's now run by an Arab majority government. We may see ISIS pivot towards what has been 10% of their operational activity over the last year, fighting the government, becoming a much bigger number, where they no longer have that same opportunity to exploit tensions within SDF-held areas, and they'll now pivot much more on attacking the government and areas and minority communities within government areas. And that's actually, frankly, much more dangerous for the stability of Syria. And I know for a fact that's where the US government, intelligence community, and others are paying a lot of attention to.
Turkey's obviously a major player in all of this too, and as you mentioned earlier, this is inextricably tied up with its efforts against the PKK. It has a long-standing enmity towards the SDF/YPG, which it sees is inextricably linked to that. How's Ankara viewing recent developments, and is there any sign that it's providing assistance to the government's campaign against the SDF?
Yeah. The first thing to say is, well, in 2025, Turkey, non-publicly, provided the US and Damascus 2025 to peacefully resolve the issue with the SDF. In other words, to get SDF integrated. Publicly, repeatedly stated, we're happy for the negotiations to continue. We demand that they get achieved. But the deadline was the end of December last year. And literally from January the 1st, we started to see the Turkish military making maneuvers, putting forces into Syria in a way that they hadn't since Assad's regime was still around. Turkish drones were back in the skies again. So there is an extent to which Turkey has been actively or kinetically involved. There's probably been 6 to 10 Turkish drone strikes over the past couple of weeks in northern Syria, hitting not individuals, but SDF bases. I have no doubt that Turkish intelligence or military intelligence has been providing coordinates and intelligence around where the SDF's concentrated, where it's moving its forces. No question, I think, in my mind, that Turkey's been assisting in that way. Units of the Syrian military that have been on the front lines, many of them are driving around in new Turkish armored vehicles, armored personnel carriers. So to that extent, Turkey has been involved. But this isn't a Turkish military operation. There aren't Turkish troops on the ground. They're not pushing forward in the front lines. But I think they have been assisting from behind. It's simply not a coincidence that Tom Barak has met, I think, 2 or 3 times with the Turkish Minister of Defense in the last few days, several times with the foreign minister as well. Clearly, Turkey is the one that is pushing some of this forward. But again, it's not these previous operations Turkey's run in northern Syria before, where that was really a Turkish military operation. They've just been guiding from behind, I think.
And I suppose the flip side of that question is Israel. It's been supportive of SDF in the past, at least rhetorically. Do you see any possibility that they might become more involved here as maybe a way to put pressure on Damascus or Ankara?
Yeah, I mean, I think behind the scenes, there's no question that the Israelis are voicing their concern to the Trump administration in particular. From what I was told a few days ago, and in fact, I think it's hit some of the media reporting today. There was a big disagreement in Erbil in a meeting that Thomas Barak attended with Mazloum on the other side of the table, in which Mazloum was, I think, suggesting that Israel could become part of this equation at some point if hostilities continued, at which point Barak got extremely upset and said, "Don't you even try to bring Israel into this." And so To an extent, I think the SDF's been trying to sort of play that card, but nothing's happened. There's been no Israeli public statements. There's been of significance. There's certainly been no Israeli military intervention. I mean, I had a meeting with a senior Israeli official just a few days ago, and we were mostly talking about other subjects to do with Syria, but this subject came up towards the end. And really, they said, it's so far away from us, it's just not a priority. Of course, we're concerned when things get unstable, but it's not something that we feel like we've got skin in the game on.
I guess finally, Charles, what's your outlook going forward?
Very uncertain. I mean, Damascus has managed to reacquire control of a significant proportion of the country's energy resources, which I think will be extremely important in 2026. This year was always going to be the year of, will the economy start to show real signs of recovery? The currency remains exactly where it was basically 12 months ago. So with Caesar Act out of the way, we all need to start seeing some results on the table, so to speak, in Syria. So I think that will help. But this deal is very uncertain. I mean, it's encouraging that both sides have agreed to it after 36 hours of really severe conflict and vicious rhetoric on both sides. So it's encouraging that both sides have been willing to take a breath and step back. But 4 days is a really long time. I mean, the Syrian government took 90% of SDF territory in less than that time. So the next 4 days is going to be a very, very long, slow wait to see, does the SDF come up with a acceptable proposal for integration to Damascus. If we get through 4 days and they submit their proposal, I would be amazed if they submitted a proposal that Damascus was willing to accept, because their track record here has always been to ask a lot more than what is realistic. And I think if that happens, Shara's response will be, khalas, enough, back to the battlefield. You're not taking us seriously. So I think the US will need to put a lot of pressure behind the scenes on the SDF to ensure that they be realistic, that they accept they are not the actor with the cards to play. And if none of those things happen, then we'll be back to hostilities again. And there, I have to say, there is a danger of, not necessarily on the same scale as what we saw in Sweden or on the coast, but when you have highly motivated fighters on the Ministry of Defense who have not got a good track record of keeping disciplined in moments of particular tension. Remember back in Sweden, it was because the Israelis intervened and that massively escalated, tensions and emotions on the ground. On the coast, there was a sense that there was a coup underway. If we have 5 or 6, for the 5th or the 6th time, the SDF refusing to implement a deal they've agreed to only days or hours earlier, I worry a little bit that tempers will fray way over the scale again. So I hope that's not the case, but there will be more of a danger of it than what we've seen over the past few days. And again, obviously, because then they will be tackling Kurdish majority areas.
Well, unfortunately, we are out of time. We'll have to leave it there. Charles, thanks so much for joining us on this program this week.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
And a big thanks also goes out to our listeners for tuning in, and finally to our production team for all of their work on this week's episode.
To find MEI's latest coverage of Syria, please visit our website at www.mei.edu. You can also follow MEI on X, Instagram, Facebook, LinkedIn, and YouTube, and subscribe to our email newsletters for the latest analysis and information about upcoming events. I'm Alistair Taylor.
And I'm Matthew Czekaj. We hope you'll listen in again next week.